Charming. So, welcome to tonight's talk, the first talk of this weekend retreat, and welcome to the retreat again. The theme of this retreat is tranquility with mindfulness of breathing. And tonight what I'd like to do is talk about the processes involved with meditation, basically, so that it leads to awakening. And I would also like to highlight the helpfulness of the instructions of the practices as they are outlined in the suttas, such as the Anapanasati Sutta. And tomorrow, it's kind of like tonight's talk, in many respects, is a kind of preparation for tomorrow's talk on the Anapanasati Sutta. And tomorrow I'll give the beginning instructions, the beginning steps on the practice called Anapanasati, otherwise known as mindfulness of breathing. And the Buddha expounded this practice. When he expounded it, he outlined it in 16 steps. And these 16 steps lead to ultimately the knowledge and insight of awakening. So when I give a talk about this sutta, I'll be outlining the steps. And I think this whole sutta is quite profound and comprehensive. Looking through it, studying it, I've realized that I've been practicing many components of it for years. And sometimes I'd spend whole retreats just on a few steps of this sutta. And what the sutta presents is quite a comprehensive way of integrating both insight and serenity or tranquility approaches, aspects of meditation, in a way that's comprehensive and complete. So I really appreciate this sutta and the directions that it gives, and the practices that we find we can do from it. So in Pali, the term for meditation is bhavana. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the term they use for meditation is gom. So bhavana actually means bringing into being or cultivating. And there's a lovely saying that you find in the suttas, and I'm quoting Alan Wallace's rendition of it here. What a person considers and reflects upon for a long time, to that his or her or their mind will bend and incline. In other words, it's what we tend to do, what we attend to tends to become our reality. And this is something that I'll speak on a little bit later about this idea of cultivating. So bhavana or meditation here is the cultivation of something. And note that it's not forcing something. It's not forcing to create something. It's about cultivating. It's about creating the circumstances, the conducive circumstances, and nourishing these circumstances, nourishing the environment for something to arise. And so when we practice meditation as cultivation, we're not forcing something to happen. We're just creating the right conditions for awakening to blossom, to grow, to come about. So coming to Gom now. Gom, and I'm not that familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, but I did practice in that tradition, in some of their traditions for a few years. The word Gom, as far as I understand, means to become familiar with your mind, or become familiar with something. And again, becoming familiar with something is not ego-driven. It might begin as ego-driven, but the awakening that we have is more becoming familiar with the way things actually are. So there's this, when we become familiar with the way things actually are, there's a sense of pulling aside the veils of delusions so we can see the truth of things, reality of things, reality our egos, for example, and the reality of the way the world is. And these both perspectives of cultivating, which is, one person mentioned when I talked about cultivating, oh, it's like you're making something to happen. Well, it's kind of really not like that. It's more like creating the circumstances. Cultivating and familiarization, or becoming familiar with oneself, are sort of the same thing. They're both leading to awakening. They're just different ways of seeing these paths to awakening. So, as I'll describe in the sutta, the first steps of meditation that are really very helpful is having a sense of seclusion. What this means, I'll tell you what it means in terms of the suttas in a little while, but the way I understand this practically is we create the right circumstances. We create a sense of seclusion both physically and mentally. So physically, it would mean that we may be shutting the door. We're shutting the door if we're in a house and there's TV outside. We're not sitting down in front of the TV when we're attempting to meditate. We're actually shutting the door and getting a sense of seclusion from the ways of the world, for example. Look, I know that there's a lot of talk and there's many practices that talk about meditation and action. And that's true. When we talk about mindfulness and daily activities, we're present and mindful for every activity. But when we're talking about formal meditation, and such as the formal meditation that we find with the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, we're talking about setting up a situation that's conducive to cultivation, that's conducive to gom, that's conducive to becoming familiar. So we arrange a place that's suitable. Now, I'm in a hut. My house is probably about 10 meters that way. I'm not sitting in front of the TV. I've created the circumstances. One thing about these circumstances, it's useful to make them quiet as possible and as tidy as possible. And I know if we can make something tidy, it's helpful. It kind of gives some order in our mind. Quiet as possible is the ideal, but of course, if there's sounds around like dogs barking or planes going overhead, we need to work with that. Or, we can't kind of control the world outside completely. Meditation's not about telling the world to go away. It's about finding the right space in the world where we can cultivate our mind. And ultimately, it's about not being disturbed by things outside. But anyway, so there's that physical seclusion. And the other thing we do is we kind of develop a mental attitude about the meditation. And this is kind of like mental seclusion. And you may have noticed that I mentioned those words, putting aside worries and concerns, putting aside roles and responsibilities, coming into the moment. And I think it's very useful to make a clear intention to do that at the beginning of a formal meditation practice. Otherwise, what may happen is you sit down and you meditate and you think, oh, there's a really good opportunity for me to plan out how I'm going to fix up the back of my yard, or what I'm supposed to, the person I'm supposed to follow up in my workplace, or what am I going to get? What am I supposed to get for shopping after this meditation? It's not a time for that. It's a time for doing what you're doing. You're making the intention to cultivate your mind. So you make that kind of, it's like a mental statement. It's a mental stance, actually. Putting aside worries and concerns, putting aside thoughts about the past and the future. That's not to say they won't come into your mind, but you know where you're at. You know what's your priority. You're coming into the moment. You're having a sense of seclusion from those other things, so you can focus completely on what you intend to do, what you motivate yourself to do. So in the sutras, when they talk about seclusion, it generally means one is secluded from the hindrances. I mean, this is the technical way of understanding the, seclusion. And the hindrances are, of course, obsessive desire or obsessive sensual desire, ill will or aversion, stiffness and dullness, or sloth and torpor is another way of describing it, restlessness and worry, and paralyzing doubt. Now, I think I've mentioned it's very useful to create a sense of seclusion from things, and it's useful to recognize the hindrances and make the intention to be separate from, to be secluded from them. That's useful. That's a useful activity. And in recent months, actually, I come across the understanding of what it's like to be freed from each of these hindrances. And when I can acknowledge that, even just temporarily free from them, it brings me joy. It's really lovely. It's really quite wonderful. So the joy of being free from obsessive desire, for example, is like the joy of being debt free. This is the analogy that's made in the sutras. This is the Buddha's analogies. The joy that comes from freedom from ill will is like recovering from a terrible affliction. You know, when you recover from a terrible affliction, you have a sense of joy arising. Oh, such a relief. It's so good to be healthy again. That's what it's like to acknowledge the freedom from ill will. The joy arises from becoming free from sloth and torpor is like being released from prison. It's like when we're in sloth and torpor, when we're having that hindrance arise, it's like we're imprisoned by our sloth and torpor. There's no movement forward. We're kind of thick and dull, and we can't see any possibilities. So it's like being free. It's great. The freedom from restlessness and worry, and I won't go into details about what restlessness and worry is. I've got other recordings on this, whole sections on it. But it is like being free from slavery. It's like we are slaves to our proliferative thinking. Restless and worry is basically about thinking a lot and worrying about things, feeling remorse and guilt, and kind of being caught up in rumination and worry, essentially. Thinking a lot, mental proliferation, that's the predominant feature of restlessness and worry. And it's like when we're caught up in all that stuff, we're a slave to those tendencies. So a reflection on freedom from restlessness and worry is the joy of being free from slavery. And paralyzing doubt, which is this chronic procrastination, chronic uncertainty, being stuck, not going forward, being uncertain, I'm really not sure about the benefits of what I'm doing. That is like, being free from that is like arriving at a destination after a very dangerous journey, arriving safe and not being robbed after a very arduous and dangerous journey. So you've arrived. So this is, when the Buddha talks about having this sense of seclusion as a preparation for the practice, he's talking about being free from the hindrances. And what's very helpful is to acknowledge your freedom, even if it's relative, and experience the joy of that. Of course, joy then becomes, as I'll mention later, one of the factors of awakening, or is one of the factors of awakening. So regardless of whether one's in a busy or noisy place, one's heart can be free, regardless. Now, these first steps to meditation include creating a wholesome and helpful intention. And we first started this retreat by talking a little bit about intentions, and we did some experiential exercises. I asked you to create your intentions. And when we have our intentions, it helps us stick to the path. When we have a good intention, it's like creating a good direction. It's easy to get lost when we're practicing. It's easy to kind of waver and be distracted and go off in a different pathway. When we can remember our intentions, it brings us back to the path we want to be on, the path that's important for us. It sets our compass, so to speak, in a direction that's going in where we aspire to. So having an intention also helps you strengthen your capacity to do something, your capacity to just going to move your pictures over here so that I'm looking a bit more central. Actually, it might look like I'm actually looking at the camera if I look at you guys. Anyway, okay. So when we can create an intention, it becomes a way of us remembering what the direction we're going, but also gives us strength to carry on when the times get tough. It gives us perseverance to continue. And in the Eightfold Path, right intention addresses helpful intentions. Right intention is the second factor on the path. We have the Eightfold Path goes right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right energy or right effort, right mindfulness and concentration. They're the 8 factors on the path. When we talk about right intention, they are usually those that are associated with letting go. Technically, it's in the sutras, it talks about as renunciation, like letting go of whatever we're clinging to. Intentions associated with goodwill, like warm friendliness and kindness and compassion. And it's also associated, and the third type of good intentions are those associated with non-harm, such as compassion again. So when we create intentions, it's useful to consider one of those 3 types, in my view. I mean, and in fact, probably most of you have that when you've created your intention. They're probably along those themes. The ones I heard were all along those themes. Themes about gaining wisdom and finding space and finding a bit of peace and so on. They're all associated with those wholesome intentions. So making an intention is really helpful. And in many respects, when we can include the one of the 4 Brahma Viharas, Brahma Viharas are warm benevolence, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. When we can include those in our practice, we got those good intentions covered. And you'll notice that I'll always begin my retreats with I'll always integrate with my retreats some practice of loving kindness. And when I'm doing a mindfulness or breath practice, I will always, set up my body, get a sense of seclusion, etc., etc. Then create an intention. It's usually about some form of warm friendliness or some form of compassion. I like to include intentions for myself, my own freedom, and also the freedom of others, because that makes the intention even more powerful. Like when we can see that we're not alone and we're part of a greater context. If we have an altruistic intention that doesn't exclude ourselves, by the way, it's not being excluding of ourselves, but in, say, an altruistic intention of, may I progress on the path to awakening for the benefits of myself and others. I mean, that's just a simple intention. That's the one I use a lot. It's pretty all-encompassing, so it's great. So now, intentions are usually in the Eightfold Path. The intentions, as you may have heard earlier, intentions are followed by right speech, right action, right livelihood. In essence, this component of the Eightfold Path is got to do with ethics or non-harming behavior behavior that's not harming for oneself or others. And in fact, behaviors that are inclining towards the well-being and happiness of oneself and others. So there's a lot I could say about that, but I'm not going to talk too much on that, other than to say that ethics, or in Pali it's called sila, and there's 5 precepts which I've mentioned at other times. I'll just go through them quickly. And training in the restraint of not killing living beings, training in restraining from not taking that which doesn't belong to us, training in the training of not restraining from harmful speech or deceptive speech, training in the practice of not harming oneself or other with sexual behavior or sensual behavior, and training in the restraint of from intoxicants to cloud the mind. They're the basic 5 precepts. I mean, that's pretty. If you can maintain those precepts or those practices, your ethics is pretty good. It's like you're keeping a clean slate. The reason I'm mentioning this is that ethics, there's a lot to say about ethics, but in the practice of meditation and the Eightfold Path, it forms the foundation and ground from which we can cultivate our minds, which we can meditate. It creates the composure and the stability and the clean conscience for us to devote our attention and our energies to cultivating our mind, or familiarizing ourselves with ourselves and the world. So before I go into more detail about meditation, I'd just like to mention a principle called dependent arising. And some of you probably heard me talk about this at other times, and it's pretty important to understand. But there is a saying. There's a lot of sayings actually, but this is a nice saying. Oh, what a tangle web we weave when at first we practice to deceive. Now, many people think that's from Shakespeare somewhere, and I looked it up the other day because I thought, which play is it from? And it's not from Shakespeare. It's from a 19th century Scottish author called Sir Walter Scott, who wrote novels and plays and poems in the early 19th century. But it's a really great saying. When at first we do, oh, what a tangle web we weave, when at first we practice to deceive. And it's like, it shows that when we start to act in an unwholesome way, or act in a way that is harming or deceptive, well, being deceptive is harmful. Actually, that's not always true. Sometimes you can be deceptive about someone who wants to murder someone. Someone's looking at you, coming to your place and saying, oh, where can I find this person? I want to kill him. And you deceive them. You say, oh, they're not here, they're somewhere else. That's actually a constructive form of speech, because you're inclining towards non-harm. But basically, when we act unwholesomely, then more unwholesomeness follows. And it's it sort of points in, that saying tends to point in the direction that when we begin to act unwholesomely, it gets more and more complicated. Oh, what a tangled web we weave. And so, it's just this understanding that when we do some things, other things seem to arise with that. Like, it's not a direct cause-effect relationship, but there's a co-arising of experience. Now, the first verse in the Dhammapada, which is a famous, it's a not so much famous, but it's a well-known Buddhist text. It's a collection of phrases that the Buddha mentioned somewhere in all the suttas. And the first verse goes something like this: all mental phenomena have mind as their forerunner. They have mind as their chief. They are mind-made. If one speaks or acts with an evil mind, dukkha, follows him just as the wheel follows the hoofprint of the ox that draws the cart. In other words, it's saying the same thing as that previous pseudo-Shakespearean statement. So when we do unwholesome acts, unwholesomeness tends to follow. And also the opposite is also true. When we choose to engage in wholesome acts, say acts of kindness and generosity and friendliness and letting go, those three intentions, compassion as well, then wholesomeness follows. And the principle that is evident in this process is dependent arising. Dependent arising is also the principle of how we get caught up in cycles of suffering, as well as how we liberate ourselves from these cycles of suffering. Often, dependent arising is often understood as 12 interdependent links or chains in a link, and one thing giving rise to another. And traditionally it goes like this. And I won't go into great explanations of all this, but it goes like this. When there is ignorance, sankharas or volitional formations arise. When there is volitional formations, consciousness arises. When consciousness arises, six sense spheres arise. When six sense spheres arise, contact or sense impressions arise. Dependent on contact with experience, feelings arise, or Vedana in Pali. Feelings arise. Feelings are the hedonic qualities of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neither. When feelings arise, dependent on feelings, now this is dependent on this, you can change it here actually, you can short circuit this. Craving or tanha arises. Craving is often called thirst, and literally thirst. Dependent on craving, grasping and clinging or upadana arises. Depending on clinging, becoming. There's something called becoming. It's also called karma bhava, or actions come to manifest, something like that. Dependent on actions or dependent on becoming, rebirth arises. And depending on rebirth, aging, sickness, death arises. Well, things change. And depending on death, ignorances arises. So this is this kind of cycle. This is called the cycle of samsara, actually. It's often depicted as a wheel. We go from one thing to another. We get caught in these cycles of suffering. And I've talked about these cycles of suffering in different ways. I've just talked about them as, sometimes when I used to run groups, I just used to ask people, do they ever get caught up in cycles of suffering? And they go, yes, of course. So we'd write it up on the board. It's just one thing happens and then gives rise to something else, gives rise to something else, gives rise to something else. Now with these cycles of suffering, there's an exit possibility. The strongest exit possibility that we can see is when we have feelings, and that gives rise to craving. If we can be mindful of feelings, if we can be present for feelings and see them for what they are, it does not necessarily need to lead to craving. That's the strongest exit possibility. But we can exit anywhere along those cycles, and that is called freedom from samsara. So, coming back to this meditation and what we do, another way of understanding dependent arising is something like this. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of that ceases. And that's the most common way it's understood. That's repeated in the sutras many times, that particular phrase. And it helps us understand that, the Four Noble Truths actually. These principles are evident in the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths, that there is dukkha, there is suffering, there is the origins of dukkha, there was freedom from dukkha, or nibbana, and there is a way to be free. They're the four truths. So when there is a cause for suffering, or when there is a cause for dukkha, dukkha will arise. When there's craving, as an example, that's not the only. Craving is caught up in this whole cycle of stuff. When there is craving, there is dukkha. When there is no craving, when you're no longer grasping after, when you're no longer clinging, when you're no longer feeding into your patterns, then those patterns don't arise. That suffering doesn't arise. So this is where meditation comes into place. Meditation helps us see dependent arising, helps us see freedom, helps us break free of cycles of suffering, whatever those cycles may be. Coming to meditation now. I've been meditating a long time, many, many years, and I've been with lots of different teachers and lived in Thailand and under meditation masters. And although I wouldn't call the place I lived in Thailand, I would say he was a lifestyle master more than a meditation master. Just the lifestyle he lived, the awakened life, and I was just part of that. It was really wonderful. So, but I guess I'm coming to the point that I've heard a lot of instructions throughout my life, and I've practiced a lot of instructions. And there is a book called Unlearning Meditation, When Instructions Get in the Road. And I respect the person who wrote that book, and it has value. And when I went to Thailand, we into the forest monasteries, not very good at speaking Thai, but enough to get by. The instruction was for meditation for me was just say Buddho, breathing in and out, go Buddho, Buddho. That was it. That was the instructions that I got. And when I've done some Zen retreats, the instructions were to just go. And I remember I checked this out with Hogan's son. You mean moo? He said, no, not moo, not moo. That was the instructions. And another aspect of that, when I used to meditate with Zen masters, it was justice. 360 degrees seeing. Justice. That was the instructions. And they have a lot of value. And I think they resonate with many people. However, when I've heard specific instructions from teachers, like more detailed instructions, they've been real gems. They've been really wonderful. The benefits of not getting many instructions is that you have to work it out for yourself, and you go through a lot of difficulty and struggle, and eventually something arises from that. But it certainly seems a lot faster, or a lot more helpful to have specific instructions from teachers that have been along these paths. And so some of what I feel is my greatest progress has come from when I've listened clearly and closely to instructions and practiced according to them, and then realized the results of these practices for myself. And it's not like these instructions are prescriptive. They're more like they're a map, giving us a kind of a view of the landscape that we're traveling along in order to find freedom, to become awake. So, and this is especially true for some of the suttas. I mean, it's just brilliant. I mean, it's 3 suttas I can think of right now, like the Satipatthana Sutta, the Sutta on the 4 establishments of mindfulness. It's so detailed, so rich, and all we have to do is follow the instructions. It's really cool. And the Anapanasati Sutta is another one. The Shorter Discourse on Emptiness is another one. They just got these, the Buddha's giving us these directions. He's pointing us in a particular way. All we have to do is follow it, and we have the experience for ourselves. So what's really good, so the Buddha's providing a map to a reality that we actually discover for ourselves. So when we cultivate the heart-mind, which is what I'm calling meditation, it's much about what we attend to and how we choose to discern our experience. And just to bring in a bit of contemporary psychology, William James, the forefather of psychology, he said, what we attend to becomes our reality. So if we attend to unhappiness, misery, and upset without being mindful, it can become our reality. If we attend to it, if we attend to mindfulness and bring mindfulness to those experiences, however, we can see them for what they are. In addition, if we attend to something that is uplifting and liberating for ourselves and others, that can also become our reality. And Dan Siegel, famous neuropsychologist, he says, where our attention goes, energy flows and neurons grow. Something like that anyway, maybe not exactly quoting him. And if we're thinking about neuroplasticity and neural pathway growth, it's all about cultivating. The factors associated with neural pathway growth is the duration of something, the duration of a particular experience that's plugging along that neural pathway, how many times it fires it, and how long it goes. I mean, there is a saying in neuroscience that goes, how does it go? Those neurons that wire together fire together. So we're talking about neuroplasticity here. How many times and how much you fire along a particular neural pathway will induce a growth in that neural pathway. The intensity of that experience will facilitate a growth. The novelty of that experience will facilitate a growth. The salience of that experience, how relevant it is for you, will facilitate growth. And the interest in it, how rewarding it is, how pleasant it is, will also facilitate neural pathway growth. So I'll just ask you to remember those features. I can give you them again if you want them, but because those features that are evident in neuroplasticity are also evident in when we practice tranquility meditation, and they're also evident in when we practice insight meditation. So in essence, with meditation, there are 3 pathways we can travel along this map that the Buddha gives us to awakening. One pathway is the pathway of tranquility first, then insight. We'll always need insight, by the way, to wake up. Insight is always necessary to wake up. Insight is the view component of wisdom. Okay, so one path is the path of tranquility. Another path is called the path of dry insight, or insight only, where one doesn't cultivate a tranquil heart-mind, one doesn't cultivate tranquility or serenity first, but one just has insight into experience. And another pathway is the pathway of tranquility and insight combined and integrated. I prefer that last one because that's the way it seems to go anyway. And these different pathways are like, sometimes they come together, sometimes they're separate, they're kind of going in different directions, but they're not going in different directions, they're always going in the directions of awakening. But sometimes they cross over, sometimes they're skillfully integrated, and sometimes they're kind of used at one point, and then one hops on another to go to another point, and then slips back into the other one. So either way, both these approaches of insight and serenity support each other. They help each other, and they arrive at awakening. So something that's useful to know in the practice along these paths of insight and serenity is the difference and functions of peripheral awareness versus attention. So these are really helpful to understand. I didn't really put much attention onto this until, say, just about 4 or 5 years ago, but it's been really powerful to understand it. Peripheral awareness is like seeing the big picture, seeing holistically, seeing the relationships of things, seeing the context of situations. Visually, what I would say is like, I'm looking at you in the screen, and I can also see in the corner of my eye, I can see a lamp over there. I can see a door over there. I can see my microphone down there, and so on. I'm not focusing on those things, but they're in my awareness. So I'm aware of them. Being in my awareness visually, they serve as an alert system. If something comes into my visual field that requires attention, I can turn to it. It's less processing and more, it involves a quicker response, and it's less personal and it's more objective, and it can be introspective and extrospective. So awareness is really helpful when we set our intentions, to be aware of the hindrances, for example. Then you're doing your practice, and out of the peripheral of your awareness, you might notice a tendency to be caught up in ill will or something like that. So awareness here alerts you to that, and then you can work with it so it doesn't consume you quickly. So awareness is really important. Attention tends to be more focused and narrow. It isolates and analyzes. It selects information from awareness. It hones in on the object. It's got to do with more processing and a slower response. It's more self-centered, and it can be introspective and extrospective, and it can be internal and external. So I can be, I can bring my attention to something out in the world, like there's another lamp over there. There's a little light over there. There's an orange colored light over there, which is kind of weird, but I can attend to it and analyze it and see it clearly. So when we meditate in both the serenity and insight paths, we're using both awareness and attention. Sometimes we'll be focusing more on attention when we're honing in on something, and sometimes we'll be more open and just kind of broad in our awareness, sort of sitting like an open monitoring. So it's just very good to know these different aspects of meditation and the differences between awareness and attention. So tranquility and insight work together. Tranquility gives muscle, clarity, and power to insight. And insight gives direction and discernment to tranquility. And practically, at a practical level, when we can have serenity with something, it gives us the calmness and the resources to cope with the insights that we might be having. like we might have insights into the empty nature of ourselves. And this could be quite unsettling. But if we can balance this with the resources of serenity, then we can stay balanced with that. Tranquility emphasizes concentration and absorption. And it's mostly based on the cultivation of samadhi. So coming back to the Eightfold Path, we have energy, mindfulness, and concentration. These three factors are what we call meditation. They are the meditation component of the Eightfold Path. Eightfold Path has wisdom, ethics, and meditation. So samadhi is this collection of mental energies. It's a gathering in of mental energies. Sometimes it's understood as a focus, but it's not necessarily confined to that. It's this settling in, and all one's mental energies are going in a unified direction. When we're practicing the path of serenity, it's very helpful to be aware of what goes with what. And it's useful to understand 5 jhana factors. I won't go into jhana factors. Jhana is, for those of you who don't know, highly concentrated states. And there's factors that are associated with this. The factors that are associated with cultivating jhanas, or the experience of a jhana, is initial application, sustained application, piety or joy, sukha or happiness, and one-pointedness. One-pointedness also unified attention, a unified mind. So initial application is just kind of coming back to this thing, remembering to bring your attention to something, bring your attention to it. Your minds might go off, you bring it back. This is like, I think this is like paddling a surfboard. You've got to work at it. It takes a bit of work. Coming back. Sustained application is like when you're paddling and then the wave picks you up. You feel the energy of the wave. So it's not so energetic. It's just sort of staying with it. Your attention staying with the object and sticking there. It's not so effortful, but it's being picked up. It's like, another comparison is like a bird flapping its wings. The bird will flap the wings, and that's like initial application. When it's got off and it's flying and it's caught the wind, that's like sustained application. Piety. Piety is joy. Joy is this effervescent, bubbly energy that you start to feel. Very pleasurable. And this is the result. This is what happens when you apply your attention, you stay in it, you have piety. When you have piety, that eventually leads to happiness, which is a more subtle experience. And these four factors, when they co-arise, they result in a unification of attention. So it's just a very good thing to know about, because you can start to become aware of these factors when you're practicing. The other thing that's useful to understand is that some ways piety is cultivated is by focusing on pleasant experiences. Pleasant experiences that are spiritual in nature. In other words, pleasant experiences that arise from concentration or living a wholesome life or acting ethically. When you can notice these pleasant experiences, they can give rise to piety. Piety gives rise to sukha. Sukha gives rise to a contentment. Contentment gives rise to equanimity. And you can kind of progress along this path of becoming more and more focused. So now insight. Insight, the features of serenity, by the way, are concentration and absorption. The features of insight it really hones in on using the mindfulness component of those factors that are all in all meditation. And something that goes with mindfulness is inquiry. So insight is very dependent on inquiry or investigation and mindfulness. It emphasizes mindfulness and inquiry. And with inquiry, we investigate into how things come to be. We're investigating into dependent arising, actually. We're looking into this, how this come to be. How can I reduce this? How can I increase happiness and well-being and freedom and liberation and awakening? How can I enhance my path? How can I let go of the hindrances, for example? And we also attend to what's called the three characteristics, universal characteristics of existence: anicca, dukkha, anatta, or anicca being impermanence. Usually it's understood as changing things. Dukkha refers to, as I mentioned earlier, unsatisfactoriness, and in this case it means how things that are impermanent, things that are conditioned, are by their nature unable to satisfy because they change, because they disappear. And then the last characteristic is not self, or emptiness, meaning I've given whole talks about this, but basically that there's no one single thing in all this experience. There's nothing that arises independently. Things arise interdependently. There's no single thing in anything. I mean, I'll just leave it at that for the moment, rather than going off on a whole hour-long spiel about emptiness. So, insight and serenity, very important. And they're pathways we can travel along. And so when we're practicing towards awakening, we choose one of these paths. Another thing that's really important to understand and engage with is something called the 7 factors of awakening, because the 7 factors of awakening, which are the factors that are needed for awakening to arise or for awakening to come about, they are also a mix of serenity and insight. So these 7 factors are mindfulness, investigation of dharmas or inquiry, perseverance or energy, joy, tranquility, samadhi or concentration, and equipoise. These 7 factors of awakening can be cultivated individually, and more often they're cultivated as a kind of a package deal. One thing leads to another. When we are mindful, then it influences investigation of dharmas to arise. When we have investigation of dharmas, we have energy and enthusiasm and perseverance. When perseverance arises, there is joy. When there is joy, it leads to tranquility. When there is tranquility, there is concentration. And the culmination of all this results in equanimity. So coming back to insight again, something that's very powerful with insight is mindfulness, as I mentioned earlier. And we also realize now that it's the first factor of awakening. And there's many different definitions of mindfulness. I like the understanding of mindfulness as being presence, like being present. Analio describes mindfulness as soft, awake presence, which is really wonderful. I also like Bhikkhu Bodhi's description of mindfulness as remembering to be attentive to immediate experience with care and discernment. I would add one thing. I would say, remembering to be attentive and or aware. So we bring in that broad perspective as well as that focused perspective to immediate experience with care and discernment. So this mindfulness gives us the power, gives us a lot of power. It gives us power to let be by remembering to be aware and attentive to the way things are, and we grow in insight and understanding. The power of mindfulness helps us let go. By remembering to be aware and attentive, we are more able to release that which is unwholesome and that leads to suffering in the long run. And by remembering to be being aware and attentive, we are more able to cultivate whatever is wholesome and beneficial in the long run. So usually what happens at the, with the cultivation of the 7 factors, the cultivation of serenity and insight, the final steps towards awakening, it's something like this. We see impermanence. This is what's featured in the Anapanasati Sutta anyway. We see impermanence. When we see things are impermanence, we have a level of dispassion. Dispassion meaning not revulsion, not aversion, just we're not eager to pick up things. We're not grasping after things. We're not trying to get things. We're cool-hearted. We have this sense of dispassion. We're not sucked into things. When there's a sense of dispassion, we start to be aware of how things arise and pass away, but emphasizing the way they pass, like the passing of things. In this process of impermanence, we have arising, changing, and then disappearing. With cessation, what happens is we notice things have arisen, but we're paying particular attention to their fading away, they're disappearing. And when we do that, we begin to let go. Well, we really let go. And letting go is one way of understanding Nibbana. Letting go of the causes of suffering, letting go of craving, grasping, clinging, becoming, birth, aging, sickness, death, and so on. This whole cycle of suffering that we get caught up in. Whatever it is that we need to let go of, we let go of it all. And that's freedom. So, tomorrow I'll talk about the 16 steps as a map we can use to wake up to the reality of things and being free from the binds of dukkha. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope it's been helpful. So let's just have a few minutes silence and reflection, and then we can have some discussion.